Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel, and today I wanted to talk a little bit about the books that I've been reading this week. So let's get talking a bit about those, and I hope you're having a really good week as well. Take care, and yeah, let's talk about those books. First up, although I'm not trying to make a habit of bringing up Booker books as I read them, because that's sort of part of a bigger project, there are a couple that occasionally break through where I really want to talk about them. And this one here, Sarah Waters with The Night Watch, is one that I wanted to talk about. Firstly, because I think it does some really interesting things with time. So the core idea of the book is that we are looking at a set of people in 1947, post-World War II, and we slowly go back through time and see the kinds of things that happened to them in the lead up to that. So we start at the end of the book and slowly move back to the beginning. And I think what's really beautiful about the way this is done is there are these subtle things that change, where we see a character who is cautious about a certain thing, and we can't quite work out why. And then we go back 3 years and we find out a little bit about why that is, and we go back 3 years again and we see even more about what's happening. And I think Sarah Waters has really beautifully captured that feeling. I mean, I'd say this, I wasn't there, but the feeling of sort of a blitz London, you know, a London where everything had just been upended, where, you know, from day to day, something was set on fire, or there was a bomb, or there was something else, and suddenly you could go from seeing somebody every day to them being gone forever. And she captures that precarity really beautifully, I think, in this book. And there are a couple of scenes in this that are really deeply harrowing as well. I mean, involving various medical procedures and other things that are going on. And I think what she does very well is look at the ways that there are all these other concerns that come up even when something as big as war is happening. So what do you do if the war happens and you become pregnant? What happens if the war is happening and you are in love with someone of the same gender and it's complicated because of the war? All of these things, and I think she covers it beautifully. There are a couple of characters in here who are in just these really fascinating relationships, both romantic and interpersonal, that are just so gorgeously rendered. And I just think this is such a beautiful, beautiful book. Next up, a bit of a wonderfully weird book, Phantom Limb by Kohler. And this is an odd book in many ways. So it starts off with what feels quite fantastical, of somebody falling down a hole sort of near a tree, sort of a dead tree, and ending up in this place where they see a human, well, what seems to be a human hand that is moving of its own free will, a little bit kind of like Cousin It. And so the book kind of goes off from there, of these weird things happening off that, and people thinking, well, this can't be real, or this has to be real. And what follows is this very strange but intriguing story of this hand, and characters trying to prove that it's a real thing. But if it is real, what does that actually mean? What is up with this? It's a weird book. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was just an odd ride, but and it's quite funny and quite silly at times, because you are dealing with something so absurd and ridiculous, but equally for the characters there's something very real about this. So the book also goes into the sort of the psychology of what it would mean for that to exist as well. So I thought this was so interesting and such an odd beat kind of book, but I think does some really quite beautiful things in amongst that as well. Next up, some non-fiction, Revathi, A Life in Trans Activism by Revathi, and translated by Nadini Marali. And this from Tilted Axis Press, who are brilliant, I think, at finding books in other languages to translate, particularly from less translated languages into English. And this tells the life of Revathi, who is a trans woman in India, and her life growing up. And she becomes this figure who is relatively well known, but we chart all the way from her early days of being a child, of kind of moving out of the house and setting up with a group of hijras, and then the various complications of what comes with that. So being a hijra comes with its own set of rules. Of some places you can go require that you do no sex work at all, and it's very clearly defined as, you know, you're here and you do begging, or you do manual labor or whatever else to pay your keep for being part of this community. In others, it's expected that there's a sex work element, and Revathi spends so much of her life, particularly early on, moving between these places, and I thought it was really beautifully done to hear from her just the difficulties she finds. So, you know, her family quite early into the book have a real issue with her, and you know, often involves some really grim physical violence as well. And I think this book just beautifully captures that and tries to tell this bigger story about what's happening. Another non-fiction book, and a little bit of an odd one in some ways, Chloe Dalton with Raising Hare. And it took me far too long to realise what pun was happening in the title of this book. Anyway, but she raises a hare. Essentially, Chloe Dalton at one point discovers a leveret, like a baby hare, and she starts to raise it, but is very aware that she wants to be able to release this back into the wild. So she tries to give it its own space. She tries not to touch it too much, because if her scent gets onto this hare, then she maybe compromises the chance that this hare is able to have to be, you know, to be welcomed back into the fold by its parents or by whoever else. And so she goes about this business of raising this hare, and it's odd because quite a lot of this book then involves her learning how to balance this with the hare. The hare is always a wild creature in this scenario. It doesn't ever become a domesticated thing that she is looking after, and, you know, like a cat or a dog or anything like that. Instead, this hare is constantly at high alert, but starts to locate itself with the home as part of its sort of landscape. So what happens really then is other hares start to either move in or try to be surrounded by this place, because to do so means free shelter and food. But also for the hare, this just is part of the landscape. And in doing so, she talks quite a lot about the specifics of raising this hare, and how hares themselves are these quite idiosyncratic creatures. And so, you know, they are very, very sensitive to small things moving in their landscape. So at one point she moves a sofa, and this hare does not enter the room for several days because it's so confused by the lack of sofa and thinks something's up. And there's this wonderful scene where at one point there are several hares all around the house, and she's having to delicately walk around the place and not disturb them. But really behind the scenes in this book is also a book about Chloe Dalton herself trying to both adapt to the rhythms of these hares and to the natural world more generally, but also give up some of these ideas of what it means to be a successful person in the modern day. And so sort of becoming less busy or becoming less overwhelmed, and instead focusing on small things like raising these hare. Yeah, really, really beautiful little book in some ways. Quite an odd one, but a beautiful book nonetheless. Last but not least, I read The Wickedest by Caleb Femi. And if you've not read his poetry collection, Poor, I really highly recommend it. I think Poor is just fantastic. It's such a crystallized version of so many thoughts and ideas and arguments and discussions that happen in the world, but in this really brilliant and propulsive set of poems. And The Wickedest picks up in a very different way on some of these ideas, and focuses more on essentially the kind of inner worlds, or the sort of inner sanctum for a lot of Black people in the UK particularly. And so it focuses on these sort of house parties essentially called Shabim, and they're given several other names during the poetry collection as well. But Caleb Femi essentially, it's a bit of a love letter to that part of Black culture. And so he talks about these house parties and the kind of communities that are created, and the ways that people are able to come together and feel safe and feel protected and feel part of something within these. And so this is, several of the poems are written as almost timestamps at Shabim. And so you see characters in these poems you know, call out for more music or for whatever, and all these things are happening. And Caleb Femi is almost writing then to a rhythm of what would a night out at a Shabim or whatever look like, or night in look like. And he sort of charts this story from there. And I just thought it was really beautifully done, really so different from Poor. it has more of this rhythm to it that is, you know, to reference it basically being alongside music. And the audiobook of this was also really interesting because you kind of get this idea of some of the pacing and the rhythm of it and the kind of background sounds that might exist within it as well. So I thought this was a really interesting one. I think I still probably prefer Poor as an overall collection. I think Poor is such a strong collection, but I still think The Wickedest has some really interesting things to show in terms of, yeah, this love letter to Black culture, and is really interesting for that reason as well. So those are some of the books I've been reading this week. I hope you are having a really great week. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye bye.